When I was in college, I had a history professor that liked to incentivize attendance by occasionally going off syllabus to discuss a random topic that he found interesting or unique. Well, one day after midterms, he decided to reward everybody that actually bothered showing up to class that day by introducing us to today's topic, and I have not been able to get it out of my head since. So, to start this all off, we're going to be talking about the Hellenic views on male genitalia, and in particular, the foreskin. I assume anybody watching this is familiar with what a foreskin is, and if you're not, you're probably too young to be watching this video anyways. To set the scene, as it were, we're going to start by going over the basics. The ancient Greeks viewed the foreskin as existing in two parts, the poste and the acroposteion. Emperor Trajan's physician, Rufus of Ephesus, describes these parts thusly. The poste, also known as the prepuce, was the part of the foreskin that ran all the way to the glans, or the head of the penis. Meanwhile, the acroposteion, literally translating to peak of the foreskin, was the part of the foreskin that extended past the glans of the penis. A long prepuce, and as such a long acroposteion, was seen as a signifier of both virility and sexual prowess in Hellenic culture. Greek physician Galen notes, "Nature, out of her abundance, ornaments all the members, especially in man, such as the skin called the prepuce at the end of the penis." Frederick M. Hodges, in his paper The Ideal Prepuce in Ancient Greece and Rome, notes that Galen is content here to leave his admiration for the prepuce unqualified by allusions to its length, but he nonetheless provides us with a powerful corroboration of the fact that the Greeks prized the prepuce on its own merits, while simultaneously associating it with other aspects of male beauty. This concept of the ideal prepuce is often visible in works of art from the time, such as these two incredible life-size bronze statues dating back to around 400 BC. This iconographic representation of beauty did not stand alone as a cultural shorthand. Exposure of the actual glands of the penis was seen as inappropriate at best and a sign of barbarity and dishonor more often than not. Today we often imagine the ancient Greeks as incredibly comfortable with nudity, and by today's standards they were. However, this understanding fails to capture the nuances of the cultural norms at the time. Anachronism has its uses, but it more often than not obfuscates the actual practices of ancient cultures that might not survive into a modern context. In The Mask of Socrates, the image of the intellectual in antiquity, Dr. Paul Zanker observes that the preventing of unwanted exposure of the glands was, quote, a sign of the modesty and decency expected, in particular, of the older participants in the symposium, end quote. Even erections, solos, implied exposure of the glands, and as such, often appeared in art portraying barbaric figures. Foreign conquerors were very commonly depicted with an erect and exposed phallus, much art using this as a shorthand for otherness. In fact, the Greek word for erection, solos, later became shorthand for lewdness in general. So how did they go about covering their shame? That would be the kynodesme. The kynodesme was a thin strip of leather or cord that was used to draw and secure the acroposteion around the head of the glands. As for the name, well, there's only one way to put this. The literal translation is dog leash. Now, most historians and linguists that have covered this topic consider the etymology to be primarily focused on the functional aspects of the item. The kion, dog, prefix, likely serves as simply a descriptive element, emphasizing the idea of restraining or tying, similar to how a leash restrains a dog. This potentially stems from the understanding of dogs as representing base sexual instincts in Hellenic society, with the tie restraining the indecency inherent in an exposed glands. However, I would like to note that in my research, I came across a 2nd century grammarian named Phrynicus Arabius, who, when writing about the kynodesme, argues that the name stems from the Attic slang for penis. So while historians argue that the etymology of the word is potentially free of euphemism, I do find it objectively hilarious to imagine the parsimonious answer to all this as just that the ancient Greeks like to refer to their junk as dogs. And honestly, it's just fun to imagine some commonality between such an ancient culture and our own. While not all scholars agree to the specific nature and origin of this practice, one theory that I find quite interesting posits that the common portrayal of long foreskins in Greek art and literature may possibly be attributed to the use of the kynodesme stretching out the foreskin over years of constant wear. This, in turn, manifested into the Greek interpretation of the beauty of an extended acropostheon, and subsequently the beauty standards that followed. In fact, one of the most iconographic representations of this device is found on an Attic red figure calyx crater painting by Ephronios dating from somewhere between 520 and 510 BCE, which shows a young athlete in the process of grasping the lips of his acropostheon with the fingers of his left hand and pulling the prepuce taut, while his right hand is poised to loop the kynodesme around the neck of the acropostheon. In fact, much of what we know about the kynodesme is gleaned from artistic representations such as these, as extant writings on the device are relatively rare from the historical record. Due to the Hellenic understanding of lewdness and beauty both stemming from the condition of the foreskin, it's only natural that preservation of this particular section of human anatomy would grow its own set of taboos over time. Even when health issues arose from injury to the foreskin, Greeks appear to have only found the practice of its removal appropriate in situations where the prepuce became so ulcerated that it began falling off on its own. In his treatise De Medicina, the largest extant work of Alexandrian medicine, Roman encyclopedist Celsus notes that, in the case of ulceration, quote, "It is the rule whenever the glans or any part of the penis is fallen off or has been cut away, that the foreskin should not be preserved, lest it come into contact and adhere to the ulceration." In another example, the Greeks hated circumcision, often equating it with full castration. So, to rewind a touch, our first evidence of Greek contact with the practice of circumcision was recorded by everyone's favorite uncle that shows up with cool stories that are probably bullshit, Herodotus. In his histories, he records the practice of circumcision by the Egyptian priestly caste with a poorly hidden disdain, using it as an example to help illustrate the vast differences that separated their two cultures. The association between the Egyptians and circumcision is on full display in another Attic red figure scene of Heracles overthrowing the mythological King Busiris. As Hodges illustrates, quote, "The painter has taken great pains to depict the priests as having fat, ugly, wrinkled, circumcised penises with a bulbous externalized glans, which contrasts sharply with the neat and attractive penis of Heracles with its elegantly long and tapered prepuce." Elegant is an interesting way to describe foreskin, but I don't know, I'm not Hellenic. In fact, when the Seleucid Empire took control of the Levant, they instituted many new laws in order to Hellenize the population centers. One of these was a law against castration, which was widely interpreted at the time to be directly targeting the Jewish practice of circumcision. When Antiochus IV came into power, he doubled down on this forced Hellenization, leading to the criminally under-discussed Maccabean revolt that foreshadowed the eventual Jewish-Roman War. Unfortunately, the Hellenic world's utter disgust for those lacking foreskin had an oversized impact on the Jewish diaspora that were making their way into cities at the time. Now, the actual history of the Jewish diaspora is a fascinating topic that I would love to cover in a future video, but even without the full context of the population migration and cultural shifts occurring at the time, it's easy to see how these two clashing practices would have significant impacts on their ability to assimilate into Hellenic society. The Greek distaste for the Jewish practice is on full display in the works of writers such as Strabo, where the historian describes the Hebrew practice as both tyrannical and superstitious, holding it up as a prime example of both primitiveness and oppression. And while other authors like Philo-Judaeus of Alexandria protest the Hellenic distaste of circumcision as coming from people with no understanding of cultural differences, making a childish mockery without context, the Greeks' understanding of the lack of foreskin is creating a permanent state of not just lewdness, but as a shorthand for moral and ethical inferiority, was bound to result in these two cultures being at odds with each other's practices. And this is where things get horrifically interesting, because it just so happens that this era is also where some of our earliest records of cosmetic surgery appear in the historical record. As with any culture, Beauty standards drove people to find a way to enhance or at least replace features that they found deficient in some way. In the same way that nowadays you might go get Botox or go on Ozempic if you're feeling bad about how you look, in the case of the Hellenic world, we actually have a large corpus of medical practices describing how people went about the practice of epispasm, or replacing and extending short or missing foreskins. Frequently, these were sought out by men of the Jewish diaspora due to the stigma attached to circumcision. In fact, the practice of epispasm became so common that it's referred to in both the Bible and the Torah. In 1 Corinthians 7:18, St. Paul alludes to this practice, writing, "Was anyone called circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised." Through this, we can infer that it was common enough among members of the early church that key figures such as Paul actually needed to address it when writing to other churches. As for the Jewish side of the issue, the increasing popularity of this led to the adaptation of, and I'm going to butcher this, Pari'ah, I'm not sure, a practice which prevented the restoration of the foreskin by a process of removing the leftover prepuce and splitting the mucous membrane. Whew. This practice was recorded in the Mishnah Shabbat, the first collection of Jewish law that laid the groundwork for the first oral Torah. Now, the Greeks referred to the condition of lacking foreskin as lipodermis, literally translating to lack of skin. This terminology could apply to those lacking foreskin from both medical or artificial actions. This condition had 3 different forms of treatment recorded in literature at the time, that being medication, traction, and surgery. For medication, Dioscorides of Anarzebus recommended soaking the skin of the penis in honey and warm water to allow for stretching. Another treatment was the application of thapsia, which physicians at the time understood to augment the volume of the parts on which it was applied due to the common practice of humorism, codified by the ancient Greeks. In fact, we even have a recipe for one of those treatments, credited by Celsus to a certain Epidaurus. As an aside note, thapsia plants, having been used as a common folk medicine for thousands of years, is actually incredibly poisonous to humans. This lends to its use as an emetic or counter-irritant. Keep in mind that what Dioscorides is recommending, while not out of the ordinary at the time, is quite literally soaking your junk in a poisonous irritant. So it's an option. In gynecology, Soranus recommends stretching of the foreskin by an appeal to aesthetics, particularly recommending it to wet nurses in the case of infants suffering from lipodermos. This was achieved in infants by simply extending and tying off the penis with a canadesme. For those that desired only small modifications to the foreskin, this was often achieved by gluing sheets of papyrus around the penis and using that to extend the foreskin a bit at a time, slowly adding wider and wider sheets. Another option recorded is by tying small weights to the canadesme as it's attached, pulling the skin forward naturally. And while this may sound like a foolish idea, in fact, the same theory is actually used in a modern reconstructive technique called tissue expansion. And it just so happens that penile skin is particularly suited to this due to its elastic qualities. Now, while soaking your dog in poisonous irritants and animal fats before tying some weights to it sounds like some sort of medieval torture method, or a really fun Friday night, depending on how you spend your weekends, this was probably your best shot if you were genuinely attempting to regenerate your foreskin at the time. The final option, surgery, would have been a much, much more unpleasant process. Now, fascinatingly, ancient physicians at the time, including the aforementioned Celsus, do specify between surgery to repair a lipodermic penis and surgery to repair a circumcised penis. Both options, however, are exceedingly unpleasant. In the case of the former, the prepuce is stretched until it covers the glands and then is tied off. Skin covering the penis in front of the pubic area is then cut in a circle, while care is taken not to sever the urethra. The skin is then pulled forward slowly, while scar tissue is encouraged to form in the portions that have then been stripped away. The practice for circumcision-based lipodermia takes this a step further. Instead of simply pulling the foreskin forward slightly, it is, and I quote, stripped by hand and again stretched forward beyond the glands, end quote. This process was much more dangerous, and the recovery took much longer. In fact, Celsus himself stresses that the dangers of this surgery mean that it should be ruled out where at all possible. Now, the thought of degloving your genitals and pulling the skin off like one of those 90s gel toys is really just as fun for me as it is for you. I do have to make one more brief digression to discuss one last foreskin fact that I didn't really know how to fit into the script. So I'm just going to go for it. In some Christian tradition, the feast of the circumcision of Christ commemorates, well, exactly what it sounds like it does. In the Bible, Luke 2:21 records that, in holding to Jewish tradition at the time, the wee baby Jesus was circumcised 8 days after his birth before finally being given his name. Now, the fact that he was circumcised implies that something had to have happened to his foreskin, and if there's one thing the Catholic Church is famous for, it's collecting the artifacts and body parts of sacred figures and displaying them. I think you see where this is going. Our first reference to the Holy Prepuce as a relic actually comes from fragments of an apocryphal gospel known as the Syriac Infancy Gospel, dating back to around the 600s AD. In it, a Hebrew woman actually preserves the prepuce of the baby Jesus in scented oil, which later on down the line made its way to Mary, who famously used said oil in the Bible to anoint the head and feet of the adult Jesus. The implications of this I will leave you to marinate in for a minute. Of course, this meant that in the Middle Ages, as possession and trafficking of religious artifacts became an important part of politicking at the time, so too did reports of the Holy Prepuce. Our first recorded instance of this relic actually occurs in quite grand circumstances. Charlemagne, neither holy nor Roman, presented the proposed prepuce to the Pontiff Primus Pope Leo III on the eve of his coronation to emperor in the year 800 AD. And in what was a common pattern for the church in the Middle Ages, there was soon a bevy of baby Jesus foreskins floating around the world. In his phenomenally titled For Shame, Professor David Farley notes, quote, "Depending on what you read, there were 8, 12, 14, or even 18 different holy foreskins in various European towns during the Middle Ages. And naturally, this belief manifested in the writings of European thinkers at the time, or more particularly, in those in the Age of Enlightenment that followed the Middle Ages. The French philosopher Voltaire, himself a relentless satirist and critic of the Christian Church, even made note of this old tradition in one of his essays on religious tolerance and superstition, writing that its veneration was, quote, much more reasonable than to detest and prosecute your brother, end quote. Which, I mean, yeah, it's kind of hard to argue with that. Like, yes, I too agree that admiring an infant's foreskin preserved in scented oils is objectively better than, say, that one time the population of Lisbon defenestrated their bishop because he forgot to ring the church's bells upon the acclamation of King John I, and I suppose there was all that other stuff. And last but not least, I would like to end on one final note. Now, this claim is likely apocryphal, but damn it, sometimes you just need to believe something's true, and this is it for me. According to an unconfirmed 19th century source, Vatican librarian Leo Alatius recorded that, in the same way Jesus Christ ascended into heaven, so too did his prepuce. And it became the rings of Saturn.